The thing about burn pits is that the smell never really leaves you. It burrows into your sinuses, your hair, the soft tissue behind your eyes, and it stays there like a permanent resident. 16 months in Bagram, 3 rotations, and Reese still caught whiffs of it sometimes. In the break room when someone microwaved fish. In the hospital laundry when the industrial dryers ran too hot. A chemical ghost. Her own personal haunting. She was standing at the medication cart on the 3rd floor of Harmon Regional Medical Center at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, counting out milligrams of metoprolol for the gentleman in 314, who kept pulling his call light every 20 minutes. When the radio at the nurse's station crackled, trauma bay incoming, ETA 4 minutes. Tally didn't look up from the blister pack. She had 3 patients due for midnight meds, a 4th whose IV had infiltrated and needed a new line, and her left knee, the one she'd wrecked during a particularly ugly week outside Kandahar, was letting her know exactly how many hours she'd been on her feet. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed at a frequency that seemed specifically engineered to produce low-grade headaches. She had grown to hate that sound in a way that felt almost personal. Her shift ended at 6 a.m. She was not counting. She absolutely was counting. Reese. Dominguez, the charge nurse, appeared at her elbow. Mid-50s, reading glasses permanently pushed up into her silver hair, zero tolerance for drama of any kind. Trauma bay needs an extra set of hands. Daniels just got pulled to the ICU. What's the call? Partial thickness burns, bilateral forearms, possible inhalation. Construction accident. Worker was torching a pipe and the propane tank went. Tally capped the medication cup, wrote a note on the chart. Send me down. The trauma bay at Harmon Regional was on the ground floor, tucked at the end of a long corridor that smelled of floor wax and hand sanitizer. Tally had worked this floor for 2 years, long enough to know the rhythm of it. Which gurneys stuck when you pulled them too fast. Which supply cabinet had a broken latch. Exactly how many steps it took from the nurse's station to bay 1 without looking. Military habit. Always know your terrain. She pushed through the double doors with 2 minutes to spare, pulling on a second pair of gloves. The paramedics brought him in at a controlled jog. He was sitting up on the gurney rather than lying down, which was either stubbornness or a good sign, and he was clutching something to his chest with his forearms. Something that Tally's brain registered as wrong, as out of place, before she could fully process what it was. Male, mid-30s, the paramedic called out. Thomas Keller, 34. Burns bilateral forearms, 2nd degree, maybe touching 3rd on the right. O2 sat 92 on scene, up to 96 in transport. He was conscious and combative the whole ride. The combative part was self-evident. Keller was trying to swing his legs off the gurney before they'd cleared the threshold. Sir, stay on the board, I'm fine. It's not me. His voice was raw, scraped sounding, like he'd been breathing smoke. He needs. And then Tally saw what he was holding. Pressed against the man's chest, wedged between his burned forearms and his jacket, was a dog. A medium-sized shepherd mix, maybe 40 pounds, brindle coat, and it was not moving the way a dog should move. Its head lolled. Its breathing was fast and shallow, the kind of rapid, effortless-looking panting that wasn't effortless at all. That was the body trying to compensate for something going wrong inside. The dog's left rear flank had a wound, not deep, not arterial, but the fur around it was singed black, and the tissue beneath was angry, weeping, the kind of thermal burn that looked deceptively small and was catastrophically painful. "Sir," Tally said, and her voice came out the way it used to come out at the aid station. Level, no elevation, no urgency, just controlled authority because urgency was contagious and she could not afford to be the one who spread it. "Sir, look at me, look at my face." Keller looked. His eyes were bloodshot from smoke. He had burn marks tracking up past his wrists, where the sleeves of his jacket had protected him. His knuckles, though, his knuckles were raw and weeping where he'd apparently shielded the dog with his bare hands. "He was chained," Keller said. The words came out fragmented, sentence structure failing under the weight of whatever he'd just lived through. The tank, it was against the fence, and the fence caught, and he was chained to the fence, and I couldn't. I got to him, but he got caught in the flash, and I can't. He has to be okay. He has to be okay. Tally assessed the dog in 3 seconds. Burns to the left flank, mild to moderate respiratory distress, heart rate elevated, visible through the thin skin of the belly. Corneal reflex intact. She could see the eye moving, tracking, not in shock, not yet. "What's his name?" she asked. "Kodiak." Cody. She'd been right. She knew it before she'd opened her mouth. She was going to do something tonight that was either the most defensible act of basic decency she'd ever committed in this building, or the professional mistake that ended everything she'd spent 8 years building since she'd come home from overseas. "Bay 2, she said. "Put him in Bay 2. The paramedic, young, maybe 25, looked at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and mortal terror. "Ma'am, we can't." "Bay 2, Tally repeated, and turned to Keller. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then walk next to the gurney. Don't put him down." She didn't look behind her. Looking behind her would have meant seeing Dominguez, and seeing Dominguez's face would have made her hesitate. And she could not hesitate right now, because hesitation killed things. Bay 2 smelled like the last patient. Antiseptic, over something sour. Tally clicked on the overhead light and started pulling supplies before she'd fully decided exactly what she was doing. Sterile saline, non-adherent dressings. The silver sulfadiazine cream was for humans, technically. But she'd used improvised wound care on a combat deployment where the supply chain was a suggestion rather than a guarantee. And she knew enough to know that the fundamental biology of a thermal wound was not dramatically different across mammalian species. "Set him here," she said, clearing the exam table with one arm, gently. Keller laid the dog down with more care than most people laid down their children. The dog, Kodiak, made a sound. Low, sustained, the kind of sound that came from deep in the chest and didn't have enough energy to turn into a whimper. Tally's hands were moving. "I need to assess him. Keep talking to him. Your voice matters more than anything else in this room right now." Keller pressed his forehead to the top of the dog's head, his burned hands hovering just above the exam table, unable to touch without pain. He started talking. Low and broken, the way men talked when they thought no one was judging them. She heard pieces of it. Something about a cabin, something about 5 years, something about the dog being the first thing he'd saved after he'd stopped being able to save anything else. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. The burn to the flank was irregular, about the size of a hand. 2nd degree at the center. The fur had protected the skin at the margins. She debrided the singed material with a saline flush, working fast but not frantically. The dog flinched but held. Keller's voice held too. She assessed the respiratory effort. The breathing had slowed slightly, which was either improvement or the opposite, and she needed to determine which. Mucous membranes. She lifted the lip carefully, checking the color. Pink. Not gray, not blue. Pink. Her exhale was quiet, deliberate. Okay, okay. She applied the non-adherent dressing, secured it with light wrap, kept her hands moving. She was 3 minutes in when the bay door opened. Administrator Pryce didn't look like an administrator. That was always the problem with men like Pryce. He was 60-ish, lean, tailored sport coat at midnight, because some men never stopped performing authority, even when the audience was fluorescent lighting and a trauma bay. He had the specific look of a man who had spent his career building systems to protect himself from situations exactly like this one, and who was currently watching one of those systems fail in real time. Behind him stood Dominguez, arms crossed, face doing something complicated that Tally had learned to read as I warned you, and also I do not entirely disagree with you, which were two things that could coexist. Nurse Reese. Pryce's voice was very quiet, which was the tell. Loud administrators were manageable. Quiet ones had already decided something. Step outside, in a moment, now. The dressing needs to be secured. Give me 90 seconds. There was a silence that felt load-bearing. Tally tied off the last strip of medical tape, checked the wrap tension, stepped back from the table, and peeled off her outer gloves. Keep the pressure uniform, she told Keller. Don't let him stand up. If the breathing gets faster or the gums go pale, you call out immediately. She walked past Pryce into the corridor. The hallway felt very cold after the warmth of the bay. Tally stood with her back straight, which was automatic. 16 months of forward operating bases had made good posture involuntary, and waited. Pryce pulled the door shut behind him. His face was controlled in the way of someone who had learned to control it specifically because the alternative was less professionally useful. You brought an animal into a sterile trauma environment, he said. I did, using hospital supplies, hospital equipment, on a non-human patient. Yes. He stared at her. She looked back. She had been stared at by a colonel who'd found out she'd requisitioned blood products outside the chain of command for a coalition partner who was about to bleed to death in a ditch. This was not that. Do you understand what a Joint Commission citation for environmental controls looks like? Pryce asked. Do you have any idea what the liability exposure is if a patient in this facility contracts a zoonotic infection because you decided to run a veterinary triage in Bay 2? The patient in Bay 2 is a burn victim with bilateral forearm injuries. The dog is a secondary concern being managed in the same space to keep the patient calm, which is standard psychological support methodology for trauma patients with service animals. Tally paused. Kodiak is a service animal. Pryce blinked once. There's no documentation. We don't ask for documentation when a patient presents at the ER. We ask when we have time. We don't have time. That's not. He stopped. Reset. That is a creative interpretation. It's a defensible one. His jaw tightened. Your badge, Nurse Reese. She'd known it was coming. She'd known it was coming since she'd said Bay 2. That was the thing about decisions made before you fully made them. They had a way of outrunning your ability to reverse them. She unclipped it from her chest pocket. The plastic was warm from her body heat. She held it out, and he took it with the efficiency of a man who had done this before and didn't enjoy it as much as people assumed. You're suspended pending a formal review. Get your personal effects and leave the premises. She walked to the locker room the long way, because the long way didn't take her past Bay 2, and she didn't want Keller to see her without the badge and understand what that meant yet. He needed to stay calm. The dog needed him calm. Her locker smelled like the protein bar she'd left in the inside pocket of her jacket. She hadn't eaten since 4 in the afternoon. She put on her civilian jacket, a navy canvas thing she'd had since before her last deployment, stuffed her compression socks into her bag, unhooked her stethoscope from the loop inside the locker door. She'd had that stethoscope for 11 years. The ear tips were replacements, but the chest piece was original. She'd packed it into a sea bag and carried it through 3 time zones. She sat on the bench for a moment, not because she was going to cry. She wasn't. She hadn't. Not in a building she worked in. Not once, but because she wanted to think. She'd made a choice. The choice had a consequence. The consequence was real. She had 6 weeks of savings if she was careful, 3 months if she was extremely careful, and the kind of professional record that would make the conversation with her next potential employer complicated at best. She stood, zipped the bag, turned off the locker light out of habit, even though it didn't need turning off. The main corridor was quiet when she came back through. Second shift at this hour had a particular stillness. The early night admissions settled, the true midnight rush not yet begun. The nursing station was understaffed the way it always was, the way everyone said was temporary and no one ever fixed. Dominguez was on the phone, back turned. Tally walked toward the exit. She passed the trauma bay corridor. She stopped. Through the small glass panel in Bay 2's door, she could see Keller, still bent over the table, still talking. The dog's head had shifted, not much, maybe 2 inches, and it was resting against Keller's arm, which meant the dog was choosing to rest there rather than pull away, which meant the dog was lucid enough to choose. She pushed through the exterior doors into the parking lot. The night air hit her full in the face. March in this part of the country was undecided, neither winter nor spring, just cold and damp and smelling of mud and distant car exhaust. She stood under the overhead lamp and tried to remember where she'd parked. She didn't hear the vehicles until they were already in the lot. 3 of them. 2 dark SUVs and a pickup truck with a scratched bed liner. They pulled in without fanfare, without sirens, without the performative urgency that usually accompanied institutional importance. Just 3 vehicles, parking with quiet precision that she recognized immediately. The way she would have recognized a specific knot or a specific radio frequency. Not a conscious process, just a body-level alertness that said, "These people know what they're doing." The doors opened. There were 8 of them, men and 1 woman, ranging in age from maybe late 20s to early 40s, dressed in the specific combination of civilian clothes and load-bearing practicality that meant something specific to anyone who'd worn a uniform. Heavy-duty waterproof jackets, boots that were worn but not neglected, hands that moved efficiently and rested in the kind of stillness that only came from having trained what to do with them in moments of uncertainty. The woman in front had close-cropped dark hair and a scar that tracked from the corner of her left eye to her jawline. She was the one who looked at Tally first. She crossed the lot at a measured pace. Not fast, not slow. The pace of someone who had already decided exactly what was about to happen and was in no hurry because hurrying was for people who weren't certain. She stopped 4 feet away. "You're the nurse," she said. Not a question. Statement of established fact. "Was," Tally said. "About 20 minutes ago." The woman looked at the civilian jacket, looked at the duffel bag. Her eyes moved the way trained eyes moved, taking inventory without appearing to. Thomas Keller. The woman said the name like she was placing it on a table between them. "He came in here. He's inside. He's okay. Burns to the forearms, 2nd and possible 3rd degree on the right. He'll need to be properly evaluated and transferred to a burn unit by morning. The dog, alive. Burns to the left flank, 2nd degree. I dress the wound. He needs a vet with imaging to rule out internal. I know what he needs. Not hostile, just factual. I'm asking if he's alive. Yes, the woman exhaled, one breath. Complete. Keller called you from inside? Tally asked. Keller didn't call anyone. He's been separated from his phone since the accident. A pause. Fire department radio traffic. We monitor it. Tally filed that away without asking why, because she already understood why. Some units maintained that kind of informal network for years after separation, because the people you went through certain things with became a different category of human connection, one that didn't have a civilian equivalent and didn't need to be explained to people who had experienced it. Your name, the woman said. Reese, prior service, Army, 68 whiskey, 3 rotations. The woman's chin moved slightly, the kind of near nod that was more acknowledgement than agreement. You know what you treated in there. It wasn't quite a question. Tally understood what she was really asking. Not the medical specifics, but whether she understood the weight of what Kodiak represented to the man currently bent over the exam table inside. I know he wouldn't leave the dog, Tally said. I know he burned his own hands down to the dermis getting to him. I know whatever happened to him before he got here, that dog is the reason he's still. She stopped. Yes, I know. The woman studied her for a moment. You lost your job, she said, suspended. Pending review, which usually means, yeah. The woman glanced back at the group, who had been standing in patient, watchful silence. Something passed between them that wasn't quite communication, just a shared orientation. She looked back at Tally. Stay here. She walked past her and into the hospital. Tally stood in the parking lot. One of the men from the group peeled off and walked to stand near her, not in a crowding way. Just proximate. He was maybe 30, freckled, looked slightly too young for the lines around his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just stood there the way some people stood, as if the presence itself was the thing he was offering. You don't have to babysit me, Tally said. I'm not. He pulled out a pack of gum, offered it to her, took a piece himself when she shook her head. Cruz hates waiting alone. She's better if there's someone out here she can check on when she comes out. Tally absorbed this. Cruz is the one who went in. Is she going to? Yeah, he said, with the simple certainty of someone who had watched Cruz do things before. She is. Inside, Tally imagined it more than she could see it. She'd seen enough of these kinds of confrontations on both sides to know the shape of it. A woman who had operated in environments where every decision had to be correct. Walking into a room with a man who had spent his career perfecting a system designed to protect him from culpability and the specific quality of silence that would fall over the nursing staff, over Dominguez, over the junior personnel, who would stand very still and try not to be visible. She'd been on the receiving end of that silence. She knew what it did to a room. The lobby doors opened at 12:38. Pryce came out first, which meant Cruz had suggested he come out rather than he had decided to. He was walking the way men walked when they wanted to appear like they were still choosing their direction. He did not look at Tally. Cruz came out behind him. She had something in her hand. She crossed the parking lot and held it out. It was the badge. Tally looked at it. She didn't take it immediately, which surprised her. She wasn't sure what she was processing exactly, but she stood there for a moment looking at her own photograph and her own name and the small printed text of her credentials. He'll put it through as a misclassification error, Cruz said. Service animal documentation issue. Someone will write a report that explains everything. You'll be back on shift tomorrow. What did you say to him? Cruz considered this. I reminded him that Kodiak has a file with the VA, the DOD, and the American Kennel Club's working dog registry, that the burn incident report will reference a service animal, and that the administrator who suspended the nurse who treated that animal will be named in the same report. She paused. I also mentioned that a friend of mine runs a veterans advocacy column that reaches approximately 200,000 subscribers, and that she'd been looking for a good story this week. Tally looked at her. He made the right call, Cruz said. There was something very dry in it. Not humor exactly, but the flat acknowledgement that the right call had been arrived at through a mechanism that had nothing to do with the man's character. They usually do, when the alternatives are clear enough. Tally clipped the badge back onto her chest pocket. It felt both lighter and heavier than she remembered. Keller, she said. He needs the burn unit. Transport is already arranged. He didn't want to leave until we got here. And Cody? There's a vet we use. She's meeting us at her clinic in 40 minutes. Cruz looked at her steadily. He's going to make it. The way you packed that wound and kept the tissue moist. The vet I spoke with said the dressing prevented most of the secondary damage. Tally looked at the hospital entrance. She thought about Bay 2, about the dog's head shifting those 2 inches to rest against Keller's arm, about the way Keller had held his burned hands just above the table surface, unable to touch without agony, hovering there anyway because the proximity still meant something. He chained himself outside, she said. It wasn't a question. She was just saying it out loud to put the shape of it somewhere outside her own head. Construction job. The property owner was supposed to have cleared the area. They didn't. Cruz's voice stayed level, but something tightened very slightly at the corner of her mouth. Keller's been out for a while, took the construction work to stay busy. Kodiak goes with him to every site. The owner knew and didn't care. She stopped. He will care now. The freckled man had moved back to the group without Tally noticing. They were talking quietly among themselves, the kind of low-register conversation that wasn't really conversation, just presence management. Cruz looked at her. Prior service. 3 rotations, yes. And now you're here. Tally looked at the building. The 3rd floor was visible from here if you knew which cluster of windows to look at, and she knew, because she'd spent 2 years learning the geography of this place, the way she'd learned the geography of every place she'd operated in. I'm here, she said. Is it enough? Cruz asked, not prying, genuinely asking, the way someone asked who understood there was a real answer. Tally thought about it for a moment. She thought about the medication cart upstairs. She thought about the man in 314 who pulled his call light too often and was scared in the particular way that people who lived alone were scared in hospitals, and how she'd learned to let him talk for 90 extra seconds, even when she was behind, because 90 seconds was nothing and it mattered to him. She thought about the burn patient she'd followed through the system for 6 weeks after a house fire, who had stopped flinching when she changed his dressings by week 3, which was small and was everything. She thought about Keller's hands hovering above the table. Most nights, she said. Yeah. Cruz looked at her for one more moment, then gave that near nod again. She turned back toward the group, said something to the freckled man, and they began the process of organized departure the way trained people did. Without ceremony, without announced conclusion, just movement that simply became the next thing. Tally stood in the parking lot until the last SUV turned out of the lot and the taillights disappeared into the dark. She looked down at the badge. She clipped it straighter, a half-centimeter adjustment, purely out of habit. Then she turned around and walked back through the sliding doors. Dominguez was at the station. She looked up when Tally came through, looked at the badge, looked at Tally's face, and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Keller needs the burn unit paperwork before transport, Tally said, and I have meds due in 3:14. The cart's ready, Dominguez said. I covered your draws. Tally nodded. She took the medication cart. The wheel on the left front still squeaked. She pushed through to the patient wing, the familiar smell of the corridor settling around her. Antiseptic and floor wax, and the faint trace of someone's dinner from hours ago, and she got to work.